As the dawn of a new millennium approaches, a sunset glow in Fort Myers, Florida, illuminates the lives of the men many credit with inventing the 20th century. Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, and Charles Lindbergh as well. Looking on from a park bench is the couple to whom this monument is dedicated, Ellie and Jim Newton.
These men were neighbors. These men were not just great men in the world. They were neighbors here, and they talked here. I've been with them when they talked and talked and talked. They weren't afraid to say what they thought. They were comfortable with each other.
They were not only comfortable with each other, they also shared a deep friendship with Jim Newton, a friendship that gave them freedom to drop fame's veil and reveal their true identities. That was no surprise to Jim's wife, Ellie. She's always known her husband has a genius for friendship.
He gave them adventure. He gave them a sense of that life could be even greater for them than it was. And he gave them, I think, something about a hope in eternal life. I don't think he talked about that, but that has been in his life. And I think that's what he gave people, something beyond this world.
Jim Newton's story goes beyond the history books and explores the private side of some of the 20th century's most public men and women. It's less about the wondrous inventions and deeds of these men than it is about their character, which continues to inspire American values. Although he never asked to meet any of these historic figures, Jim Newton was their confidant, advisor, and more importantly, uncommon friend. From nature come our greatest lessons. That was proven by one inventor who chose this majestic coastline along Fort Myers, Florida, as his living laboratory. It was the native bamboo tree that first brought Thomas Edison to Southwest Florida. From it, he had hoped to develop a filament for a new invention, the light bulb.
The filament of the first practical incandescent lamp which I invented was of carbonized cotton thread. In the search for a better filament, I carbonized everything like me.
Thomas Edison made his first visit to these shores in 1885. Soon after, some of the world's most famous men followed. Their friendship with Edison brought them here, but it was the endless knowledge and beauty this environment provided that made it impossible for them to leave. And in a way, they never have.
Well, there's no question that these men were movers in our century. Edison, was said to have invented the 20th century, which he did late in the 19th. But I never asked to meet any of them. And each one came across my path, or rather I came across his path, and we became friends. And they seemed to trust me.
It was 1924, and Jim Newton was developing Edison Park, one of Fort Myers' first residential communities. It happened to be located directly across the street from Thomas Edison's winter home. In the early stages of construction, the young developer was summoned by Mrs. Edison.
So I went over, and then when she came out, she looked at me and said, "I didn't send for you." I was 20 years old. I said, "Well, here I am, Mrs. Edison. What did you want?" She said, "I wanted the head man." So I gave her my card. I was president. And that slowed her down a little. And then she said, I don't like what you have across the street. I said, what do you mean, Mrs. Edison? And there was an entrance being put in, and in the middle of that entrance, the centerpiece, was a Grecian maiden pouring water from an urn. And we had a big tarp around so no one could see what was happening.
No one could see until several members of the local garden club went snooping with flashlights late one night. Stunned by their discovery, the ladies immediately went to report their findings to Mrs. Edison.
She said, you have a lady over there without any clothes on. And I said, well, what can we do? You don't like that? No, she said, I really don't. So I said, what can we do? We can't put street clothes on her, can we? No. Well, what can we do? She had no answer. So I said, how about a veil? Oh, she said, a veil would be wonderful.
That small favor started a lifelong friendship. And when Edison Park was finally completed, Mr. Edison agreed to be on hand for the opening ceremonies.
And when the time came, he had flu, high temperature. And the doctor, of course, said stay in bed. So I went over to commiserate just before the thing started. There he was on the porch, fully dressed. I said, well, what's this, Mr. Edison? He said, let's go, Jim. I learned a great deal from that. He had told me, a kid, that he'd only known for months, really, that he would be there, and he was there. And that's integrity, and that was one of the qualities in Mr. Edison's life that I admired so much.
It is a great reward for me and my colleagues and co-workers, many of them still living, that we have survived to see the fruits of our labors. The record is wonderful, but fine as it is, it can be made still better, and I have a feeling that in your hands it will be.
All things come to him who hustles while he waits. That's what Edison wrote to his young friend Jimmy Newton. Words that also served as a blueprint for Edison's own success.
He had that wonderful sense of optimism, that wonderful sense of the answer was always out there. One time when he was closing one of his books of experiments that had failed 1,000 times on one experiment, he said, you know, we're making real progress. We know 1,000 ways in which it can't be done.
When asked about the formula for his own success, Edison responded by saying that success was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Perspiration was nothing new to Newton, who labored long hours at Edison Park under a brutal Florida sun.
One day I was working in the ditch, digging it out deeper on McGregor Boulevard by the statue and by the entrance. And I remember I got a shovel of dirt and was throwing it over my shoulder. And there, coming down McGregor Boulevard, just a few feet above me, and the windshield open, was Mr. Edison, driven by Freddie Ott. And he looked right at me, and I looked right at him. And from that moment on, I knew we were friends, because I knew that he loved somebody who would spit on his hands and take a shovel and go to work.
Edison's home along the Caloosahatchee River gave him access to some of the world's best fishing. While he spent many afternoons with rod and reel in hand, it wasn't always fish that interested Edison. Oftentimes he fished without even baiting his hook. What he was really fishing for was time to think, thoughts of a genius that revolutionized the world.
We think of Edison as a great inventor, and we think of him in terms of the light, and he electrified the world. We think of him as sound. He gave the first sound ever in the world's history that was played back again.
First words I spoke in the original phonograph, a little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
While Edison excelled as a serious scientist, friends saw a man quick to laugh who was thankful for a great joke.
What do you think of the Einstein theory?
I don't think anything of Einstein's theory because I can't understand it.
That fun-loving side led to another brilliant invention that changed the way the world is entertained.
Pioneer of motion pictures, the late Thomas Edison at the camera, and his friend Henry Ford reenact the filming of one of the first movies.
Remember, he invented the movies. He actually made the first 1,000 short movies before Hollywood got into the act. One of his masterpieces was the Great Train Robbery, which was much longer than the little ones they'd done. But actually, when he wanted recreation, I would come over and take him, usually 9 o'clock show, to the Arcade Theater. And he usually did it when the paper said there was going to be a Western. And there was William S. Hart, and at the end of the time there was Tom Mix, and there were others, but he loved that boom boom.
He loved that boom boom, but he couldn't hear it. That's because at age 10, Edison was stricken with a fever, and as a result, suffered a severe hearing loss. In his final days, he was almost deaf.
And then, of course, when he invented sound movies, he invented himself out of his great pastime because he couldn't understand. He actually said he felt that actors were better in the silence because they had to do everything in their acting. Their voices meant nothing. Like Charlie Chaplin and these others, all had to appear in the acting and in the titles. So as the sound came on, he couldn't go. I couldn't take him, because he couldn't hear.
What do you think of the sound pictures of today?
That's what I think of the talking picture.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I never heard one.
The solution came through the caring help of another friend, George Eastman of the film company, Eastman Kodak, a giant in the movie industry invented by Mr. Edison. Eastman jumped at the chance to return the favor.
So Eastman saw what the old man was up against, you see. Here he'd done himself out of his real entertainment. So he then got the Westerns that came out and titled them Sound or No Sound, and sent them down here and to New Jersey in the summertime. And the old man could sit right there in his living room and get everything there was out of it by watching the titles. He didn't hear the sound. So that this was a friend to a friend.
Ironically, the man who the world views as its greatest inventor was expelled from elementary school for being a slow learner. That experience could have been the reason why Edison himself was so sensitive to the value of building self-confidence in others. And what could build more confidence than being part of the team that created the light bulb?
He looked it around and finally he gave it to this 12, 13-year-old boy who was very nervous. So, and on the way up the steps, he got to the top and dropped it. It meant they had to go on for hours and hours and hours to build a new bulb. When the time came, they all stood around to see what he'd do. And at the last moment, he handed it to the same boy. And he did the job perfectly. Think what would have happened to that boy if he carried all his life that failure without the chance to make good. And that was the sort of thing Mr. Edison did. He encouraged young people. When he saw something in a young person, he tried to bring it out.
I congratulate you, young man, in having been chosen in this nationwide contest. You are at the threshold of your career.
Newton saw a great humanity in Edison, and he believes the inventor's compassion came largely from a belief in an even greater inventor.
He needed to take a glass of milk every few hours. And as he held it up one time to Metacroft, he said, he looked up and he held it as a toast, and he said, after all, the Almighty is still the greatest chemist. And you can follow it all through his life. These various things came up that gave him that sense of what was beyond. And he said, the deeper I get into science, the more I see that there has to be a captain on the bridge with a capital C.
Newton spent precious moments with Edison in the final days before his death. He saw a man gently letting go of a life that was devoted to improving the quality of life for everyone.
As he went into this coma finally in October, I went to see him, and Mrs. Edison took me into the room, and here he was in this coma. And she leaned down and in her way said, "Dearie, Jimmy is here." And he came out of the coma and looked and he waved and he said, "Hello, Jimmy," and went back in again. And then later, I wasn't there, but Mrs. Edison said he looked up, came out of the coma and looked straight ahead and said, "It's beautiful over there." And then, of course, we know how he finally left us. And finally, as Charles says, he left us, and 3 minutes later, the clock on the mantelpiece stopped. And they've kept it stopped ever since at that place.
While the world said goodbye to a genius, Henry Ford's loss was much more personal. Ford idolized Edison and called the day they met a turning point in his life. During their first meeting, a young Ford confided in Edison his dream of building a gasoline engine that would give the automobile to the masses, a dream many believe would never come true.
And Edison listened, and he told more, and finally, when Edison said it's a self-contained unit, I'm trying an electric car which isn't self-contained. It's a self-contained unit. It can be done at a price that the ordinary workman can do. He said, and he banged on the table, Edison did, says, "You've got it, young man, go to it." Ford said, that's the thing that gave me real encouragement to go ahead with what was considered an impossible task. That brought them together, and they became very close friends.
Ford honored Edison for many years by giving him the first car off the assembly line, the first Model T, the first Model A, the first V8, and the first Lincoln. Ford never missed an opportunity to pay back Edison for his friendship and encouragement over the years. One example occurred in 1914, when Edison's photographic laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, burned to the ground. Edison's first reaction was to remark to his son Charles.
He said, "Go get your mother and get her to bring her friends down here. You'll never see another fire like this." This was Edison in the middle of all this. So a few days later, a check arrived from Henry Ford, and he said, "Rebuild your plant." Finally, Edison forced him to take the principal back, but he never would take any interest.
The check was for $750,000, a fortune in 1914. Jim's friendships gave him an extraordinary opportunity to witness history, and in some cases, actually to be a part of it. Like the day when Jim brought a reporter over from Miami for an interview with Mr. Ford here in the driveway of his Fort Myers home.
And we landed right here in this yard. And Ford came out, and he never sat down as usual, so let me pace back and forth. The reporter and I sat on the running board of one of the two Model A cars that were there. And he had his interview with Mr. Ford about his philosophy, a great philosophy, and then he left. And then Ford said to Frank Cancel, his assistant, "Shall we show Jimmy what he's been sitting on?" So he opened the hood, and there was the V8 engine. It was the greatest industrial secret of that time. How would Ford cast in one block a V8 engine and make it work in an inexpensive car? And there it was, not known by anybody except the Ford people in this high secrecy. So I looked at it, and I realized that the reporter there was sitting on the running board within 4 or 5 feet of the best story of his life, and he had gone off without it.
Ford and Edison often were seen driving around Florida in a Model T, sometimes joined by other legends, men like Harvey Firestone or naturalist John Burroughs, who was a standout with his foot-long, stark white beard. So naturally, a great deal of public attention followed them wherever they went. But sometimes the most famous men of their time would pass by undetected.
They were driving through the country and stopped for gasoline at a way out, little tiny filling station. And Firestone got out to sort of buy the gas and get it in, and he said to the gas attendant, "Do you know who that is sitting in the front seat? That's Henry Ford. He made this car." The guy nodded. And then he said, "Do you see who that is in the back? That's Thomas Edison. He did the whole electrical sequence in the world today." He said, "Yes." And he said, I'm Harvey Firestone. I made those tires right there." The guy said, "Well, if you tell me that's Santa Claus in the back seat, I'm going to jump right through my skin."
Ford revived square dancing by calling the best old fiddlers to Fort Myers, and on more than one evening, Newton took a spin around the dance floor.
We rolled back a little furniture there in the living room, and he did the calling, 1, 2, 3, and Mrs. Ford was my partner, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, back and forth, and that's where I learned.
During Ford's final days, only the closest of friends gathered at the Ford estate. When word of Henry Ford's death reached Ellie and Jim Newton, they drove to the Dearborn home to console Mrs. Ford.
So the gate swung open and we went in. And when we got there, she was all by herself. And she said that when Mr. Ford had died very suddenly, he said there had been an outage of electricity and they'd had to light candles. And she said he had come into the world by candlelight and he went out by candlelight.
Edison helped perfect the tires Firestone invented. They became friends during the time the two spent at Edison's Florida home. It was there that Newton first began his friendship with Harvey Firestone. At the time, Newton was struggling to keep his new housing development, Edison Park, afloat during the Florida land bust of the 1920s.
And he said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Well, we guaranteed when these people bought the lots earlier that we'd put in these streets and sidewalks and trees and other. And I feel I can't think of shutting down no matter what's necessary until that's done." And he said to me, "I respect that. I respect that integrity."
It wasn't long before they were working together. They were the initial boom years for Firestone.
There are few people who realize the importance of rubber and what it means to our commerce and welfare.
And it was Newton's job to open new service centers around the country.
It actually worked out to be 400 cities and towns in the United States. And in our middle year, we were buying a property every 48 hours, negotiating for it and buying it. And we were finishing a building every 48 hours.
During those same years, Jim became close friends with Firestone's eldest son, Bud, who confided in Jim, telling him that he had a serious drinking problem. Previous attempts to stop drinking hadn't worked, and Bud was desperate.
I talked to him about change, about what then was the Oxford group, which meant not to change your faith, but let your faith change you. And that I had experienced the fact that when you turn your life over to as much of God as you know and let Him run it, miracles can happen in your life, and had happened in mine. And he said, it may happen to others, but it's not happening to me.
Even though Bud was skeptical that this Oxford group could do anything to help him, he agreed to go with Jim to a meeting.
10 years ago, the doctors all gave me up. Said liquor was killing me. Said I didn't have the courage to stop drinking.
No one knew it at the time, but that meeting served as the genesis for what would eventually become Alcoholics Anonymous. The members present at that meeting would later meet in Akron, Ohio, with Dr. Bob Smith and Bill Wilson, who are recognized as the founders of AA.
And I'll never forget Mr. Firestone. As we walked up the lawn, the hill on the lawn where Bud was with his friends at the top, he saw Bud, and he saw him as a new man, and he stopped cold with me, and I could see the awe on his face that God had given him back his son that he had despaired of.
Newton decided to follow his own spiritual calling, one that led him to the works of Dr. Alexis Carrel, a Nobel laureate who wrote an insightful book called Man the Unknown, a bestseller in 1935. Newton and Dr. Carrel spent many days in deep discussion. Previously, Carrel had been awarded the Nobel Prize in 1912 for his work in suturing blood vessels and for his early work in transplanting organs. He also was recognized for saving many a soldier's life in World War I with his innovative method of treating wounds. But it was Carrel's part in the development of the heart perfusion pump that would connect him and Newton with yet another of the world's most famous men, Charles Lindbergh.
Anne's sister, Anne Lindbergh's sister, Anne Morrow's sister, Elizabeth Morrow, had a difficult heart. It needed operation. There were no operations in those days. Lindbergh felt there should be a way to stop the heart enough to repair it. And that was a conception of his. But nobody could do it, and he kept asking doctors why it wasn't and who could talk about it. They finally referred him to Carrel at Roxbury Institute. And he went to Carrel and said, why can't we do it? He said, it's been tried again and again. These perfusion pumps wouldn't work. They got infection, they got all kinds of things. He said, do you mind if I tackle it? Carrel was happy, and they worked for 5 years. And they developed the first successful perfusion pump, which many people owe their lives to today.
The two graced the cover of Time magazine in 1938 and were applauded around the world for their success. That same year, at Dr. Carrel's insistence, Lindbergh met with a young businessman, Jim Newton, to discuss another experiment, this one dealing with faith.
I met Lindbergh then for the first time, and remember then he was the most sought-after man in the world.
He also was a man struggling with his own spirituality. Newton used the meeting to tell Lindbergh about an experiment that had worked well for him some years earlier. The experiment was really quite simple. Newton says the experiment was to turn as much of his life and will over to God as he could.
And that's when things began to dawn in my life. I tried to, in the morning, before I got going, take some time to really listen and see what happened. And direction came, changed my whole life. Lindbergh, all during this time that I was telling him, kept asking questions. And he said, I like the scientific way you approached it. You didn't go from some dogma. You went by experiment and you found out it worked. And I think that had quite an effect in Lindbergh's life.
Carrel felt the spiritual impact of the meeting on Lindbergh was momentous, and from that same meeting with Newton came a best friendship. Friendships were not easy to form for the private Lindbergh. In fact, his need for privacy after his historic flight became legendary.
We'd meet at the Engineers Club in New York and work for a couple hours, say, let's get out and take a walk. We'd walk around a couple blocks 3 or 4 times, and he always put on a hat, pulled it down, and glasses without any lenses in them. And I said, why do you do that? He said, well, you don't want to spend your life shaking hands with people who are congratulating you. You've got to do something in the world. I've done the Atlantic. I've put my time in aviation. I want to do other things.
Charles Lindbergh, Goodwill Ambassador, meets his future father-in-law, Ambassador Morrow, 7 months after flying the Atlantic. This is Anne Morrow, his bride-to-be.
Lindbergh's daughter, Reeve, recalls how her father came to terms with the demands fame put on him.
My father chose not to be very involved with this enormous and really kind of ephemeral structure that was blown up around his famous flight and created an idea of fame in many, many millions of people. He chose not to be involved in that because it was very confusing. It is. It's very confusing. It's not really real. It's not real in the way a family life or a work life or a human progress through a career or through on a mission. I think my father had many missions in his life. Fame isn't really very real compared to those things, compared to ethics, compared to people you love, compared to your daily life and the way you want to lead it. So he did turn his back on that. He didn't think it was very important.
Lindbergh eventually viewed fame as a form of death and became increasingly unavailable to journalists. When journalists took photos of his dead son Charles at the morgue, his poor relationship with the press intensified. But Jim quickly became an intimate friend, and he explains that to understand Lindbergh's private side, we must remember the event that made him the greatest public figure of his time.
Those of you who are younger generation don't realize the world effect it had. When he disappeared over the ocean from Newfoundland, was gone 14 hours over the ice cap, the Great Circle Roof, he just disappeared.
Those who went before him also disappeared permanently.
As the gasoline-weighted spirit of St. Louis resists Lindy's early efforts to get it off the ground. Fire is a momentary menace should the plane crash. Danger is served notice of its presence even before the plane takes the air. But Lindy sends the ship skyward. He's on his way.
Lindbergh, known as the Lone Eagle, flew the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris on May 21, 1927, flying across the ocean at times just several feet above the waves. During that flight, the world became one, urging on the spirit of St. Louis.
The world held its breath because they admired the courage of this man. Both compasses went out, the land compass and the magnetic compass went out for quite a time. So in fog, you don't know where they are. The greatest fight was to stay awake. He had been awake 24 hours before he took off, and then he had 33 and a half hours ahead. And his greatest battle was not with ice, which was a big one, not with fog, and not with the compasses going out, but with sleep.
Ici Radio Paris. Un bateau pêcheur près de Cherbourg. Charles A. Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy as they call him, landed at Le Bourget Airport, Paris at 5:24 this afternoon.
He went alone, and it's exploded something in the world.
That something may have been the belief that almost anything was possible, and it was. Just 42 years after Lindbergh's historic flight, Neil Armstrong took man's first steps on the moon.
Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Man on the moon.
You're looking good here.
What?
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
The Eagle landed, and the lone Eagle believed aviation brought the world closer together. According to his daughter, he also believed that same technology could tear it apart.
When he first flew and flew over the whole world, he found that it brought him access to wilderness areas that he had never seen before and gave him an understanding of the planet. And later on when he flew, he saw what had happened to those wilderness areas and wondered whether he himself had contributed to some of that destruction. In fact, there's this quote that people often repeat that he did say, I know he said it during his 60s. He said, "If I had to choose, I would rather have birds than airplanes."
That theory was one shared by Newton as well. The two believed there was a definite need to find a balance between science, technology, and the environment. The natural tropical environment of Southwest Florida provided the setting for their numerous sailing trips.
My father and Jim Newton were friends in a way that was almost like a brotherhood. They were like brothers, very close. Also, I don't think there's anything they couldn't say to one another. And I think also that for my father, Jim was one person who always understood even when he wasn't saying anything to him. Jim has been really the deepest kind of friend that my father ever had. To have a friend like Jim to whom he could say anything at any time in complete confidence was a treasure.
That treasure was shared as well by Anne Lindbergh and Ellie Newton. Their friendship began in the 1940s as young authors with a mutual respect for each other's published works.
I believe she is really one of the most gifted. Her books are beautiful. And they keep selling, you know, her Gift from the Sea, which was written over on Captiva. That keeps selling everywhere. She has been loved for many things. Her books, her poems, but above all her life, because she went through the tragedy of the kidnapping and death of her first child. So she's a very loving person, and she carries a great many things in her heart.
She also carried adventure in her soul.
I mean, she loved being with my father and working the radio. She was his radio operator. She was a very fine pilot. But what she loved best was becoming a glider pilot. She was, in fact, the first licensed woman glider pilot in America. And what she said about it was that you could hear the birds sing, and you could hear the movement of the grasses below the wings, and you could feel the columns of air holding you up in a glider the way you never could in an airplane with a motor.
Anne felt many precious moments in their marriage came from the solitude and beauty they experienced together in the sky. In fact, the two even set a cross-country record in the Sirius, a dual cockpit plane. At the time, Anne was 7 months pregnant.
I think that she absolutely loved it. I don't think it was a question of being put through something. She was very much a partner, very much an equal, and they really completed each other, I think, both in the flying and in the writing and in the way that they lived together. It was an unusual couple, but very different people, but not divided. And that was an example for us. That was something to look after and follow.
It was while flying that both Anne and Charles felt closest to God. Charles felt that his famous flight would not have been possible if not for the assistance of unseen forces, which is why even though he flew the Atlantic solo, He always referred to the crossing as the flight we made.
But he felt he was assisted, and in that flight, by what he called phantoms that were in and out of the plane, that gave him directions. And as you know, with all the ice, with all the fog, with all the difficulties crossing that, he landed within 3 miles. He crossed Ireland within 3 miles of where he had calculated.
99-year-old Ellie remembers the role that Charles played on one of the most important days of her life.
Well, he was best man at our wedding, and he said it was the only time he would ever have done that.
Lindbergh's stern face in the wedding picture reveals just how uncomfortable these events were for him, but it was a testament to the true friendship the couples enjoyed. Along the way, there also were lessons learned from each other, like the time Lindbergh dared Newton to follow him as he dove into a frigid North Atlantic. The warm-blooded Floridian did so, but timidly.
I went in up to my neck. I didn't want to get my hair wet and let it freeze. So the next day, it was the same thing. He dared me to go in. I went. And I went in all the way that day. And we both came out, dried somewhat, not too much, and my hair didn't freeze, and I had felt a lot more comfortable than the first day when I was in the water. And I realized then that there was something to be said and learned from that. When you're going to do anything in life, go in all the way. It's commitment, and things will be a lot better. And he said, you know, I've found out that when I commit myself to something real, unforeseen forces come to my aid. And when he taught me to fly, which he did, the bad part about it was that he had to do acrobatics first. I tended to turn green with acrobatics. Probably other people would. But when he saw me turning green enough, about to snap my cookie or lose my lunch, he would then level off and we'd do takeoffs and landings or whatever we were working on then. The one time he surprised me, we were on a field, a short field, and he said, go over to the edge of the field in the middle, which I did, and turn around and take off across the field. Well, I didn't think there was space for that, and he evidently did. I said, well, Charles, look at the power wires over on the other side of the field. And he had experience with power lines. You know, I missed him by 20 feet when he took off for Paris in 27. But he said, go ahead, give it the gun. So I applied the brakes, gave it the gun, took off, pulled back on the stick, getting up towards the wires, up, and finally, I knew it wasn't going to make it. He said, are you all through? I said, I am. And he took it and raised it up, and we went over. Now, I thought that was a risky thing, but it wasn't, because when I cogitated and ruminated later, I realized that he always had an out, and he judged it, and I judged it later as I looked at him. There was room to go under those wires if I didn't get enough oomph in that plane to go over it. So he taught me two things then. Have an out, number one, and always you can do more than you think you can.
Even in our present condition of unpreparedness, no foreign power is in a position to invade us today.
One of the most painful experiences for Lindbergh, in addition to the death of his infant son, was the controversy surrounding his pre-World War II stand on isolationism.
When England asks us to enter this war, she is considering her own future.
Up until Pearl Harbor, he and many other Americans wanted us to stay out of the war.
And that of her empire.
The controversy began when Lindbergh went to a reception at our embassy in Berlin at the invitation of the American ambassador. Lindbergh privately told Newton that he was being used by the American government to determine the size, quality, and productive capacity of the Luftwaffe, which was headed by German Field Marshal Hermann Goering, second in command to Adolf Hitler.
But as Goering came in, he presented Lindbergh with a box. And as Lindbergh opened it, it was a medal that they give to foreign civilians. And Goering said, "This is for your bravery in crossing the Atlantic and subsequent flying." Well, the pictures were taken of it, and it led to a really intense campaign that he was a Nazi sympathizer, not to hand the medal back. He couldn't hand the medal back because he was there on a diplomatic charge to find what the German secrets were. When he went to the South Pacific, which was in the middle of the war, as a civilian, working for Ford Motor and Chance Boat, he went to improve the flyability and the weight load of the planes. And it was at great risk because he insisted on flying combat, which he wasn't supposed to do. He had a number of narrow escapes. One he describes as coming right at a Japanese plane, right at, and they both pulled up at the last minute. He could feel the air rush of the meeting of those two planes in the air. He said, "I had absolutely no fear because I realized in my mind that there'd be freedom either way. Freedom if I survived, and freedom if I died."
In his final year, the same courage Lindbergh displayed to conquer the Atlantic Ocean would help him face the final frontier, his own mortality.
He was in the hospital in New York and had been there for quite some time. And he realized that death was coming soon. And so he had the 6 doctors standing there, and he asked them if they could do anything more for him medically. And they said, "Really no, except keep you alive a little longer." And he said, "Well, what you're saying is that it's no longer a medical problem, it's a philosophical problem. And I'd rather spend 1 day in the island of Malloy, our home there, than 30 days in the hospital."
One of his doctors warned Lindbergh that with his deteriorating health, he would never be permitted to board a flight to Hawaii. Lindbergh proved him wrong when, out of respect to the Brigadier General, Pan American Airlines quickly scheduled a private charter. Lindbergh refused the special treatment. Then United Airlines urged the Lone Eagle to just show up, and he did. The flight to Maui would be his last. As he flew west across the country, Charles and his lifelong flying companion, Anne, pointed out to family members the places the two pioneers had visited while barnstorming or mapping routes in the early days of aviation. Lindbergh held on, and he made it to his beloved Maui. As he exited his final flight, pilots surrounded the plane and quietly saluted him.
I miss him. I talked to him 3 nights before. And Anne called the next day to say, 3 days later, to say that he'd gone. I just had the feeling that he crossed the line in a great way. And then I felt, go with God, friend and brother.
If my father were here today, he would be working on the preservation of the planet and what he used to call balance, which is balancing technology, increasing technology, and the preservation of the environment, which includes not just, saving the whales and preserving the rainforest and the kind of things that we're hearing about, but it really includes saving ourselves, saving the human culture and the culture of every other sentient living being, because his sense was that we were going to be in trouble if we didn't turn around and use our technology and our intellectual capacity for caring, for taking care.
At a company convention in 1896, Mr. Ford met a gentleman there that changed his life. He met Thomas Edison.
Today, the curious come to the Edison and Ford estates in Florida to see where that friendship flourished. A living legacy to the genius of Thomas Edison comes alive each year in Southwest Florida during the Edison Pageant of Life. The artistic genius of renowned sculptor D.J. Wilkins created a lasting tribute to three of Southwest Florida's friends and neighbors here in Centennial Park in Fort Myers, capturing their spirit and their time here together. As school children walk past this monument, the lessons of history will hopefully inspire a new generation. Maybe a young scientist in the crowd just needs encouragement. They'll find it here. From Edison, they'll learn that it's only failure if you give up. From Firestone, the importance of integrity and innovation in business. And from Ford, that a young man's risky dream of a gas engine can revolutionize the world. Providence played a role throughout Jim's life. In fact, it seemed to guide him. The passage of time has only strengthened his reliance on that guidance. All of his uncommon friends who changed the world through science shared this spiritual belief. 93 years old, Jim thinks it's Providence at work once again. With so many years now separating his time with Thomas Edison, one of his lessons endures, one that was really more of a gentle warning not only for Jim, but for all of us.
And he was not at all optimistic about the future because he felt science he had helped create could go too far unless we took more moral and spiritual control. They felt that inherently in them.
This sentiment is shared by all of Jim's uncommon friends. They also recognized in each other a genius for invention and a spirit of adventure. All believed in the power of God and man to change the world. After all, they had done it.
I've been asked, what would they do today? I don't know what they do today, but they'd be straight to the point, as it was then. And I feel we miss them. We miss them amazingly. They could be classed as not just the people who helped make a century, but more than that, people who really and truly were humanity's friends.
Perhaps it was serendipity that gave Jim such extraordinary insight into the lives of these great men. After all, he met them one by one in his own search for the deeper meaning of life. He found it, and along the way, another gift came his way: uncommon friendship.
And Jim will always be with us, and we will always be with him. Thank you. God bless you.
Amen.